Clara Martinez had always believed that time moved in one direction, forward, relentlessly forward, carrying people through moments that became memories, memories that became stories, and stories that eventually became the whispered legends families told to make sense of love that outlasted the people who created it. But at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in October, sitting in the ICU waiting room of St. Joseph's Hospital, while her grandfather Henry fought for breath in the room next door, Clara discovered that time was more negotiable than she'd ever imagined. It started with the music box. Henry had been carrying it when the paramedics found him collapsed in his apartment, clutched against his chest like a talisman against whatever force was trying to pull him away from the world. The music box was an antique, ornate silver with intricate engravings that seemed to shift and dance in certain light, containing a melody Clara had been hearing since childhood, but had never been able to identify. The nurses had placed it on Henry's bedside table, assuming it was just another personal item that family members brought to make sterile hospital rooms feel more like home. But Clara knew the music box was more than sentimental decoration. It was Henry's most treasured possession, inherited from his own grandmother, carried through 3 wars and 4 decades of marriage, and never wound or played, except on the most important occasions. Now, as Clara sat in the uncomfortable hospital, chair-watching machines measure her grandfather's heartbeat in electronic beeps and digital displays, the music box began to play by itself, but it was playing backwards. Clara had heard the melody thousands of times, at Christmas mornings and birthday celebrations on quiet Sunday afternoons, when Henry would wind the box and let its song fill his living room with the kind of peace that came from objects that held more history than the people who owned them. She knew every note, every pause, every delicate trill that made the melody both melancholy and hopeful. But tonight, the melody was playing in reverse. Notes that should have resolved upward fell downward. Phrases that should have begun at the beginning were starting at the end. The familiar tune was transforming into something entirely new, still beautiful, still recognizable, but somehow oriented toward a different relationship with time and memory. Clara reached for the music box, intending to wind it properly, or perhaps close the lid to stop the impossible reverse melody. But the moment her fingers touched the silver surface, the hospital room around her shifted. Not physically. The machines continued their electronic monitoring. The fluorescent lights maintained their sterile buzz. The sounds of late-night medical activity continued in the hallway outside. But Clara's perception shifted, as if she were suddenly seeing the room from a different temporal angle, as if the backwards music had opened a doorway to a version of reality, where cause and effect flowed in the opposite direction. In this shifted reality, Clara could see Henry not as he was now, unconscious, fragile, tethered to machines that were working harder than his failing heart, but as he would be in conversations they had never had. She saw him sitting up in the hospital bed, eyes bright and alert, telling her stories about their family that he had never shared. She saw herself, older somehow, listening with the kind of attention she wished she had given him during all the Sunday dinners when she'd been distracted by her phone and her own concerns. She saw them laughing together over jokes she had never heard him make, saw them crying together over losses she didn't recognize. Most impossibly, she saw Henry as a young man, younger than Clara was now, standing in a garden that didn't exist anywhere she had ever been, holding hands with a woman Clara had never seen but somehow recognized as essential to understanding who Henry had been. Before he became her grandfather, the backwards music played for exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Clara knew because she timed it on her phone, though she couldn't explain why timing an impossible event seemed important. When the melody finished, or began, depending on how you understood the relationship between musical phrases and temporal direction, the music box fell silent. Clara opened the lid, expecting to find the familiar dancing figurine and the tiny mechanical components that had created melodies for 70 years. Instead, she found a compartment she had never seen before, containing a folded piece of paper and a key that looked like it belonged to a door that no longer existed. The paper was covered with handwriting in Henry's distinctive script, but it contained words Clara had never heard him say, and phrases that seemed to respond to questions she had never asked. "My dearest Clara," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means the music box has begun playing our conversations backwards and you are finally ready to hear the stories I never learned how to tell you forward. Melodies from tomorrow's past, Clara had visited Henry every Sunday for as long as she could remember, sitting in his living room drinking coffee that was too strong and eating cookies that were too sweet, listening to him tell stories about the war and her grandmother Elena, and the early days of his marriage, when everything was possible and nothing was guaranteed. But she had never heard the stories that were written in his backwards letter. According to the reversed correspondence, Henry had been in love twice, once with Elena, whom Clara had known and adored, and once with a woman named Isabel, whom he had met during the war but never married, never brought home, never mentioned to his family. The backwards letter described Isabel in details that made her feel more real than some living people Clara knew. Her laugh that sounded like silver bells, her habit of humming while she worked, her way of seeing hope in situations where everyone else saw only difficulty. The letter explained that the music box had belonged to Isabel originally, that she had given it to Henry during their last night together in a small French town, whose name had been erased by decades of trying to forget. She had wound the box and made him promise that he would play it whenever he needed, to remember that some kinds of love transcend the practical limitations of geography and circumstance and the conventional expectations of what constitutes a proper life. I kept the promise, Henry's backwards letter continued, but I kept it imperfectly. I played the music box to remember Isabel, but I never told anyone about her because I thought that loving someone I couldn't have while being married to someone I could have was a betrayal of Elena, rather than an expansion of the heart's capacity for multiple truths. Clara read the letter 3 times, trying to reconcile this version of her grandfather, a man who had loved 2 women simultaneously and spent 60 years carrying secrets about the complexity of emotional loyalty, with the Henry she thought she knew, who had seemed devoted to Elena's memory and uninterested in romantic complications. But as she read, Clara began to understand that the backwards music box wasn't revealing contradictions in Henry's character. It was revealing layers of experience that didn't fit into the simplified stories families tell themselves about who their loved ones are and what their lives have contained. The second page of the letter contained instructions that sounded like directions to a treasure hunt, designed by someone who understood that the most valuable discoveries required multiple steps and careful attention to details that seemed unimportant. Take the key to my apartment, Henry's backwards handwriting instructed. Look behind the 3rd book from the left on the shelf beside my reading chair. You'll find Isabel's letters arranged in chronological order, spanning 47 years of correspondence that Elena not only knew about but encouraged. Clara stared at this sentence until the words stopped making conventional sense. Elena had known about Isabel? Had encouraged their correspondence? How was it possible that 2 women had shared Henry's love not as rivals, but as collaborators in caring for a man whose heart was large enough to contain multiple kinds of devotion? Elena understood. The letter continued as if Henry could hear Clara's confusion across the temporal distance created by backwards melodies and reversed causality. She understood that love is not diminished by being shared, only complicated by being denied. Isabel was the love I couldn't choose. Elena was the love I could build a life with. Isabel was my connection to the person I had been during the war. Elena was my connection to the person I became afterward. They were different loves serving different purposes, and Elena was generous enough to understand that supporting my relationship with Isabel was a way of supporting my relationship with the entirety of my own experience. Clara looked up from the letter to the hospital bed, where Henry lay connected to machines that measured heartbeat and blood oxygen and brain activity, but couldn't measure the complexity of a man who had spent 60 years navigating the emotional geography between duty and desire, between the love you build and the love that builds you. She wondered how many other stories Henry had never told her, how many other complexities she had missed by assuming that the version of him she knew on Sunday afternoons was the complete version, rather than just the grandfather-shaped portion of a much larger and more interesting person. Clara folded the backwards letter carefully and put it in her purse along with the key that supposedly opened doors to understanding she hadn't known she was missing. She looked at the music box, wondering if it would play backwards again or if this had been a one-time revelation, designed to prepare her for whatever she was about to discover in Henry's apartment. As if responding to her curiosity, the music box opened its lid without being touched, and the familiar dancing figurine began to turn. But instead of dancing to the melody Clara knew, the figurine moved to a different rhythm entirely. Slower, more deliberate, as if it were dancing to music that existed in a different relationship with time. And Clara heard voices, not through the music box's mechanical speakers, but somehow through the air around the music box, as if the backwards melody had opened a channel to conversations that existed in a temporal dimension adjacent to the present moment. She heard Henry's voice, younger than she had ever heard it, speaking to someone with an accent Clara couldn't identify but found immediately familiar. "Isabel, you have to understand that leaving you doesn't mean I love you less. It means I love you differently. It means I love you in a way that exists outside of time and geography and the conventional requirements of marriage and domestic partnership." And she heard a woman's voice responding with the kind of calm clarity that suggested this conversation was part of a longer discussion they had been having for years. "Henry, I have never asked you to leave Elena. I have never asked you to choose me instead of her. I have only asked you to love me in addition to her, to let our connection exist alongside your marriage rather than in competition with it." Clara listened to this impossible conversation between her grandfather and a woman who had died before Clara was born, a conversation that was somehow taking place in the present moment, despite being rooted in events that had occurred decades earlier. The voices continued for 17 minutes, discussing the logistics of maintaining long-distance emotional intimacy, the ethics of loving two people simultaneously, and the ways that honesty about complicated feelings could strengthen rather than threaten a marriage built on mutual respect and genuine affection. When the voices faded and the music box closed its lid, Clara sat in the hospital chair feeling like she had been given access to graduate-level coursework in the advanced mathematics of human relationships. She had learned more about love in 17 minutes than she had learned in 24 years of observing her grandparents' marriage and assuming she understood its essential dynamics. She looked at Henry, still unconscious but somehow more present than he had been earlier, as if the backwards music had awakened not his body, but his capacity to communicate across the barriers that separated conscious conversation from whatever form of connection was possible when conventional dialogue was no longer available. The conversation we never had. Clara left the hospital at sunrise, driving through empty streets, to Henry's apartment with the key that opened doors to stories she had never heard, and the beginning of understanding that her grandfather was a more complex and interesting person than she had ever given him credit for being. Henry's apartment building was a converted warehouse in the Arts District, chosen not for its convenience or practical amenities, but for its high ceilings and large windows that let in enough natural light to read by without artificial illumination. Henry had moved there after Elena's death, explaining to the family that he needed space that felt different from the suburban house where they had raised Clara's father, and where every room contained memories of domestic routines that no longer had anyone to perform them. Clara had visited the apartment dozens of times, but always as a guest receiving carefully curated presentations of Henry's post-Elena life. She had seen his reading chair, his kitchen table, his collection of books about military history and gardening. She had never been invited to explore, to open drawers, to examine the contents of closets and storage areas where people kept the artifacts of experiences they didn't regularly discuss. Now, using Henry's key and following his backwards instructions, Clara approached the apartment as an investigator rather than a visitor. The third book from the left on the shelf beside Henry's reading chair was a volume of poetry by Pablo Neruda, worn from handling but carefully maintained. Clara removed it from the shelf and found, tucked behind it, a wooden box containing 47 years of correspondence between Henry and Isabel. The letters were organized chronologically and numbered sequentially, suggesting that Henry had not only saved every piece of their correspondence but had created a filing system that would allow him to trace the evolution of their relationship across decades. Clara opened the first letter, dated 3 months after Henry's return from Europe, and found herself reading Isabel's response to Henry's description of his wedding to Elena. "My dearest Henry," Isabel wrote in elegant handwriting that reminded Clara of calligraphy exercises, "I am so happy to hear about your marriage to Elena. From your description, she sounds like exactly the kind of woman who will support your growth into the man you are meant to become. I hope you will not interpret my joy about your wedding as indifference to our connection, but rather as evidence that love can celebrate the beloved's happiness even when that happiness takes forms that don't include the lover directly." Clara read through several more letters, marveling at the sophisticated emotional intelligence both correspondents brought to their unconventional relationship. Isabel wrote about her work as a translator, her travels through South America, her own marriage to a man named Carlos, who apparently knew about her connection to Henry and supported it as a meaningful friendship that enriched, rather than threatened, their domestic partnership. Henry wrote about his career as an engineer, his pride in Clara's father's academic achievements, his struggles with Elena's illness and eventual death. The letters revealed a 47-year conversation about literature, politics, family dynamics, and the philosophical questions that arise when intelligent people try to live thoughtfully in a world that often rewards thoughtlessness. But more than that, the letters revealed a model of love that Clara had never encountered in real life or popular culture. Love that was deep and genuine but not possessive. Love that celebrated the beloved's other relationships rather than competing with them. Love that existed primarily in emotional and intellectual intimacy, rather than in physical proximity or domestic partnership. Clara found Elena's handwriting mixed in with Henry and Isabel's correspondence. Not love letters, but friendly notes from Elena to Isabel, thanking her for birthday, gifts sent from Argentina, sharing updates about Clara's father's wedding and Clara's birth, asking for book recommendations and offering recipes for Argentine dishes that Henry particularly enjoyed. The three-way correspondence painted a picture of a triangle that was supportive rather than competitive, where all parties understood that emotional resources were expandable rather than finite, and that loving one person more didn't require loving other people less. Clara was reading a letter from Isabel dated 6 months before Henry's heart attack, when the music box in her purse began to play backwards again. This time, the melody was different. Not the familiar tune she had grown up hearing, but something that sounded like a lullaby played in a minor key. And with the backwards melody came another impossible conversation, this time between Henry and Elena. "Henry," Elena's voice said through the temporal channel opened by reversed music, "I want you to promise me something about Isabel." "What kind of promise?" Henry's younger voice responded. "Promise me that when I die you won't stop writing to her because you think maintaining that connection would be disrespectful to my memory. Promise me that you'll understand that supporting your relationship with Isabel was one of the ways I loved you, and that I want that support to continue even after I can't provide it directly." Clara felt tears beginning as she listened to her grandmother, whom she had known as a practical woman, focused on immediate concerns like grocery shopping and medical appointments, reveal herself as someone who had thought deeply about the complexities of love and loyalty, and had made sophisticated decisions about how to support her husband's emotional well-being in ways that transcended conventional expectations about marriage and fidelity. "Elena, I don't know how to love both of you without feeling like I'm betraying one of you," Henry's voice said through the backwards music. "Love isn't betrayal when it's honest," Elena responded. "Betrayal is when you pretend to have feelings you don't have or when you hide feelings you do have. You have never pretended with me, and I have never asked you to hide your connection to Isabel. That's not betrayal. That's trust." The conversation continued for 23 minutes, during which Clara learned more about her grandparents' marriage than she had learned in 24 years of family dinners and holiday celebrations. She learned that Elena had encouraged Henry to maintain his correspondence with Isabel not despite their marriage, but because of it, because Elena understood that Henry was a more complete and happier person when he could access all the layers of his emotional experience, rather than compartmentalizing parts of himself to avoid complications. She learned that Henry and Elena had discussed Isabel regularly, that Elena had contributed to some of Henry's letters, that the two women had developed their own friendship through their shared investment in Henry's well-being. She learned that love, when practiced by emotionally mature people, could be collaborative rather than competitive, expansive rather than exclusive. When the backwards music stopped and the impossible conversation ended, Clara sat in Henry's reading chair surrounded by 47 years of correspondence and feeling like she had been given a master class in advanced human relationships. She understood now why Henry had never told her these stories during their Sunday afternoon visits, not because he was ashamed of the complexity, but because she hadn't been ready to understand that love could be this sophisticated, this generous, this willing to support forms of happiness that didn't conform to traditional expectations. She looked at the music box, wondering if it would continue revealing backwards conversations, or if she had learned what she needed to learn to understand the man who was fighting for his life in the hospital room, where machines measured heartbeat, but couldn't measure the fullness of a heart that had learned to love expansively. When music becomes memory, Clara returned to the hospital at noon, carrying the wooden box of letters and a new understanding of her grandfather as someone who had lived a much more interesting and emotionally sophisticated life than she had ever imagined. She found Henry exactly as she had left him, unconscious, connected to machines, breathing with mechanical assistance, but somehow he seemed more present than he had during the previous night. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, Henry's attending physician, met Clara in the hallway outside the ICU with the kind of careful expression that suggested she was preparing to deliver news that would require both professional honesty and personal compassion. "Clara, your grandfather's condition has stabilized, but he remains in a deep coma. The tests show significant brain activity, which is encouraging, but we can't predict when or if he'll regain consciousness." Clara nodded, processing the medical information while simultaneously trying to reconcile it with the evidence that Henry was somehow communicating through backwards music and impossible conversations. "Dr. Hernandez, is it possible for coma patients to be aware of their surroundings even when they can't respond conventionally?" Dr. Hernandez looked intrigued by the question. "There's growing research suggesting that some coma patients retain more awareness than we previously understood. We've documented cases where patients later reported hearing conversations, recognizing voices, even forming new memories during periods when they appeared completely unconscious. So he might be able to hear me if I talk to him?" "It's certainly possible. Many families find that talking to coma patients provides comfort for both the patient and the family members, regardless of what the patient can consciously process." Clara thanked Dr. Hernandez and returned to Henry's room, where the music box sat on the bedside table looking like an ordinary antique rather than a device capable of facilitating communication across temporal boundaries. She arranged the letters from Isabel chronologically on the hospital's rolling table, creating a timeline of Henry's secondary love story that spanned from 1952 to 1999. She began reading the letters aloud to Henry, starting with Isabel's first response to news of his wedding and progressing through decades of correspondence that documented not just a long-distance relationship, but the evolution of three people who had learned to love in ways that expanded, rather than limited their capacity for connection. As Clara read, she began to understand that the letters weren't just personal correspondence. They were a kind of collaborative autobiography, with Henry, Elena, and Isabel contributing different perspectives to the story of how love could be practiced when people were brave enough to move beyond conventional expectations about exclusivity and possession. When Clara reached the letters from the 1980s where Isabel wrote about her first grandchildren and Henry wrote about Clara's birth, the music box began to play backwards again. This time, the melody was one Clara recognized, a lullaby that Henry used to hum when she was small, but played in reverse so that it sounded both familiar and entirely new. With the backwards lullaby came another impossible conversation, this time between Isabel and Elena. "Elena, I want to thank you for sharing Henry with me all these years," Isabel's voice said through the temporal channel created by reversed music. "I know that conventional wisdom would say that wives and other women are natural competitors, but you have shown me that love can be collaborative when people are secure enough in their own connections to support their beloved's other relationships." Elena's voice responded with warmth that Clara remembered from childhood, but had never heard, directed toward someone outside the family. "Isabel, you have given Henry access to parts of himself that I couldn't reach. You've been his connection to the young man he was during the war, to the dreams he had before domestic responsibilities required him to become more practical. Supporting your relationship with him has been one of the ways I've been able to love him completely." Clara listened to this conversation between two women who had loved the same man for 47 years without ever meeting face-to-face, who had found ways to support each other's connection to Henry, rather than competing for his attention or demanding exclusivity. She realized she was witnessing a model of love that was both more complex and more generous than anything she had encountered in her own romantic relationships or observed in popular culture. The conversation continued for 31 minutes, during which Isabel and Elena discussed their strategies for supporting Henry through Elena's illness. their shared concern about his tendency toward isolation after her death, and their joint hope that he would find ways to remain connected to both of them after Elena's death made their three-way collaboration impossible to maintain in its original form. "Isabel," Elena said near the end of the conversation, "I need you to promise me that you'll help Henry understand that loving us both was never a betrayal. It was evidence that his heart was large enough to contain multiple truths simultaneously. After I die, he's going to need that reminder." "I promise," Isabel replied. "But Elena, I need you to promise me something too." "What?" "Promise me that if Henry dies before he's ready to let go, you'll find a way to help him communicate what he needs to communicate. Love this complex deserves to be understood, not just remembered." Clara looked at the music box, understanding suddenly that the backwards melodies and impossible conversations weren't random supernatural events, but Isabel and Elena keeping promises they had made to each other about ensuring that Henry's sophisticated approach to love would be understood and appreciated rather than simplified or forgotten. The dance between time and love. Over the next 3 days, Clara spent every available hour in Henry's hospital room, reading through the chronological correspondence, while the music box provided backwards soundtrack to a love story that was more complex and beautiful than any romance novel she had ever encountered. The letters revealed that Henry, Elena, and Isabel had been in regular communication for 47 years, sharing updates about their families, their careers, their travels, their philosophical developments, and their ongoing analysis of how to love multiple people simultaneously without causing harm or creating unnecessary complications. Isabel's letters from the 1960s described her work as a translator for international development organizations, her travels through South America and Africa, her marriage to Carlos, who apparently became friends with Henry through their shared correspondence, and her growing understanding that love could be a collaborative rather than competitive enterprise when all parties approached it with honesty and generosity. Elena's contributions to the correspondence revealed a woman who was far more intellectually curious and emotionally sophisticated than Clara had realized. Elena wrote about books she was reading, political developments she found concerning, philosophical questions that arose from raising children in a world that seemed to be changing faster than anyone could understand. She wrote about her illness with matter-of-fact courage, discussing her symptoms and treatment options while simultaneously planning for Henry's emotional well-being after her death. Henry's letters showed the evolution of a man who had initially felt guilty about loving 2 women simultaneously, but had gradually learned to see his capacity for multiple connections as a gift rather than a failing. His later letters discussed his work as an engineer with the same emotional intelligence he brought to describing family relationships, suggesting that his approach to love had influenced his approach to professional problem-solving, and vice versa. But the most remarkable discovery was that the correspondence hadn't ended with Elena's death in 1999. Henry and Isabel had continued writing to each other for another decade, with Elena's memory serving as a continuing presence in their relationship rather than an obstacle to its development. Clara was reading one of these post-Elena letters when she encountered a passage that made her understand why the music box was playing backwards and facilitating impossible conversations. "My dearest Isabel," Henry wrote in 2007, "I have been thinking about time lately, about the way love seems to exist outside of conventional temporal boundaries. When I hold the music box you gave me in 1945, I can hear not just the melody as it plays forward, but also as it might sound if time moved differently. I can hear our conversations as they happened, but also as they might happen if we could somehow communicate across the barriers that separate past from present from future." Isabel's response, dated 2 weeks later, was even more explicit about the temporal possibilities of love that transcended physical limitations. "Henry, I have been having dreams in which time moves backwards, in which conversations begin with their conclusions and end with their premises. In these dreams we are able to communicate not just as we are now, but as we were when we first met, and as we will be when we understand the full meaning of our connection. Perhaps the music box is not just a mechanical device but a kind of temporal instrument that allows love to reach across boundaries that seem absolute but are actually permeable." Clara looked up from the letter to see Henry's eyes, open, focused, and alert, looking directly at her with an expression of recognition and gratitude. "Clara," he said, his voice hoarse from days of unconsciousness but clear and present. "You found the letters." "Grandpa," Clara managed to say, her voice breaking with relief and amazement. "You're awake." "I've been awake," Henry said gently. "I've been listening to you read Isabel's letters. I've been waiting for you to understand the story before I tried to explain it." Clara reached for his hand, feeling the familiar warmth and strength that she had been afraid she might never feel again. "Grandpa, the music box, it's been playing backwards. I've been hearing conversations between you and Isabel, between you and Grandma Elena. Impossible conversations." Henry smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose carefully constructed plan had worked exactly as intended. "Not impossible, Clara, just oriented toward a different understanding of how time and love intersect." Isabel and Elena both knew that some kinds of communication don't stop when people die. They just require different instruments. Clara looked at the music box, which was sitting silently on the bedside table, but somehow seemed more present and significant than any of the medical equipment that had been monitoring Henry's vital signs. "How is this possible?" "Because love creates its own temporal physics," Henry said, sitting up in the hospital bed with more strength than someone emerging from a 3-day coma should have possessed. "Because Isabel and Elena loved me and each other enough to find ways to ensure that the full story of our relationship would be understood. Not just the simplified version that fits conventional expectations about marriage and fidelity." Henry gestured toward the chronological arrangement of letters Clara had created on the rolling table. "For 60 years, I lived a love story that most people would consider impossible or inappropriate. I loved 2 women simultaneously, deeply, completely, with the full support and collaboration of both women. Elena and Isabel understood that love multiplies rather than divides when it's practiced honestly and generously." Clara felt tears beginning as she realized that she had been witnessing not just a supernatural communication across temporal boundaries, but a final gift from 3 people who had spent decades learning to love in ways that transcended conventional limitations and wanted to share that knowledge with the granddaughter who would inherit their legacy. Backwards through the years, Henry's recovery was medically inexplicable and emotionally inevitable. Dr. Hernandez ran extensive tests that showed no physical reason why a man who had been in a deep coma for 3 days should suddenly regain full consciousness with no apparent neurological deficits. But Clara understood that Henry's return to consciousness wasn't medical. It was collaborative, the result of promises kept by people who had learned that love could operate according to different rules than the ones taught in conventional relationship guides. Over the next week, while Henry regained his physical strength and prepared to return home, he and Clara spent hours discussing the 47 years of correspondence that had documented his relationship with Isabel and Elena's supportive participation in that relationship. "Clara," Henry said on his 4th day in the hospital, "I need you to understand that what Isabel, Elena, and I created wasn't an affair or a deception or a failure of conventional marriage. It was an expansion of what marriage could include when people were secure enough in their primary relationship to support each other's secondary connections." Clara had been processing this concept for a week, but she still struggled to understand how it had worked practically. "But weren't you ever jealous? Didn't Grandma Elena ever feel threatened by your relationship with Isabel?" Henry smiled with the patient expression of someone who had spent decades explaining complex emotional arrangements to people who had been trained to think about love in binary terms. "Jealousy assumes that love is a finite resource, that loving one person more means loving other people less. But Elena and I discovered that love actually multiplies when it's shared honestly. The more deeply I loved Isabel, the more I appreciated the different kinds of love Elena and I had built together. The more Elena supported my connection to Isabel, the more grateful I became for Elena's generosity and emotional intelligence." Henry reached for one of Isabel's letters from the 1970s, where she wrote about visiting Henry and Elena during one of her rare trips to the United States. "Isabel stayed with us for 2 weeks in 1976. She and Elena became genuine friends, not just women who shared affection for the same man. They discovered that they had similar interests in literature and politics, that they enjoyed each other's company independent of their connections to me." Clara tried to imagine her grandmother, whom she had known as someone primarily interested in domestic concerns, engaging in intellectual conversations with a worldly translator from Argentina who had been corresponding with Elena's husband for 25 years. The image required expanding her understanding of Elena from grandmother to complex woman with inner life and sophisticated emotional intelligence. "Did Dad know about Isabel?" Clara asked. "Your father knew that I maintained correspondence with friends from the war, but he didn't know the emotional depth of my relationship with Isabel until after Elena died. When I showed him the letters, he was initially concerned that I had been deceiving his mother, but when he read Elena's contributions to the correspondence, he understood that their marriage had been stronger rather than weaker because of their approach to love." Henry pulled out a letter Elena had written to Isabel in 1995, 5 years before Elena's death. "Read this aloud," he suggested. "It will help you understand how Elena felt about sharing me with you." Clara read Elena's elegant handwriting. "My dear Isabel, Henry has been particularly melancholy lately, missing you more than usual because it's been 2 years since your last letter. I want you to know that when he misses you, I miss you too, because your correspondence brings out aspects of Henry's personality that I treasure but can't access directly. You make him think about poetry and philosophy and the larger questions that get buried under the daily responsibilities of marriage and parenthood. When you write to him about books you're reading or places you're traveling, he becomes more intellectually curious and emotionally expansive. That expansion benefits our entire family." Clara looked up from the letter, finally understanding that what she had been witnessing through the backwards music wasn't a supernatural phenomenon but an educational experience designed by 3 people who had wanted their granddaughter to understand that love could be practiced in ways that were more sophisticated and generous than most people imagined. "The music box," Clara said. "How did it know when to play backwards? How did it create those conversations?" Henry smiled and reached for the music box, opening its lid to reveal the dancing figurine and the mechanical components that created melody through precisely calibrated gears and springs. Isabel had the music box modified by a clockmaker in Buenos Aires who specialized in unusual temporal mechanisms. She wanted to create a device that could play music forwards or backwards, depending on the emotional needs of the situation. Henry pointed to a tiny switch hidden beneath the main winding mechanism. When the switch is set to forward, the music box plays conventional melodies that create conventional emotional responses. When it's set to backward, the music plays in reverse and creates what Isabel called temporal displacement, a state of consciousness that allows people to hear conversations that exist outside of linear time. Clara examined the switch, amazed that such a small mechanical modification could create such profound alterations in her perception of time and causality. "But the conversations I heard, they seemed too real to be just psychological effects of reversed music." "Because they were real," Henry said gently. "Isabel and Elena both understood that consciousness doesn't stop when bodies stop functioning. They understood that love creates connections between people that transcend physical presence. The backwards music didn't create their voices. It just made it possible for you to hear voices that were already there, conversations that were always available to anyone who knew how to listen." Henry took Clara's hands in his own, looking at her with the kind of serious attention he had given her when she was small, and he was teaching her important lessons about how to live well in a complicated world. "Clara, I'm telling you all of this because you're 24 years old, and you're starting to make decisions about what kinds of relationships you want to create. Most people limit themselves to conventional models of love because they don't realize that other options exist. But I want you to know that love can be collaborative rather than competitive, expansive rather than exclusive, generous rather than possessive." Clara felt the weight of inheritance, not just of stories and letters and music boxes, but of permission to love in ways that transcended the limitations she had assumed were natural and inevitable. The final song's beginning. Henry was discharged from the hospital on a Thursday afternoon in late October, returning to his apartment with Clara and a new understanding between them about the complexity of family history and the expandable nature of love. Clara helped him reorganize the letters in chronological order, creating a comprehensive archive of his 47-year correspondence with Isabel and Elena's collaborative participation in that relationship. But more importantly, Clara began to understand that the backwards music box experience hadn't been designed to teach her about Henry's past relationships, but to prepare her for making her own decisions about how to approach love in her own life. "Clara," Henry said as they arranged the letters in his reading chair. "There's one more thing I need to show you." He pulled out a letter that was different from the others. Newer paper, different ink, Clara's name written on the envelope in Isabel's distinctive handwriting. "Isabel wrote this for you 3 months before she died in 2009. She asked me to give it to you when you were old enough to understand that love could be practiced in ways that most people never explore." Clara opened the envelope with trembling fingers, finding a letter addressed to her but containing wisdom that seemed designed for any young person trying to navigate the complex terrain of adult relationships. "My dear Clara," Isabel's letter began, "I am writing this to you from Argentina, where I have spent 64 years thinking about love and learning that it is more flexible and generous than most people imagine. Your grandfather and grandmother taught you that love is the only force in the universe that gets stronger when it's divided, not weaker. They showed you through 60 years of collaboration that the heart has room for multiple devotions when those devotions are supported by honesty, generosity, and mutual respect. I want you to know that love is not a finite resource that must be rationed or hoarded. Love is renewable energy that regenerates through use. The more deeply I loved your grandfather, the more capacity I developed for loving other people, my husband Carlos, my children, my friends, my students, my community. Love taught me that emotional resources expand through practice, not through conservation. Your grandfather and grandmother discovered this same truth in their own way. Elena's support of Henry's connection to me didn't diminish their marriage. It enriched it by allowing Henry to access all aspects of himself, rather than compartmentalizing parts of his experience to avoid complications. When people are secure in their primary relationships, they can afford to be generous about their beloved's secondary connections. As you navigate your own relationships, I hope you will remember that love comes in many forms and serves many purposes. Some love is for building daily life together, sharing meals, raising children, creating domestic stability. Some love is for intellectual companionship, discussing books, exploring ideas, challenging each other to think more deeply. Some love is for emotional support during difficulties. Some love is for celebration during victories. Some love is for maintaining connections to different aspects of yourself. Most people assume that one person must provide all forms of love, but that assumption creates impossible pressure and inevitable disappointment. The people we love are not responsible for meeting all our emotional needs or for being compatible with every aspect of our personalities. When we free our loved ones from the burden of being everything to us, we create space for them to be themselves more authentically, and we create space in our own lives for multiple forms of connection and support. Clara, you are entering the years when you will make decisions about what kinds of relationships to invest in and how to approach the complex negotiations that arise when multiple people love each other in overlapping but different ways. I hope you will remember that conventional models of love are not the only options available to you. I hope you will be brave enough to create relationships that serve your actual needs rather than conforming to other people's expectations. Most importantly, I hope you will understand that the correspondence between your grandfather and me was not an affair or a betrayal or a failure of conventional marriage. It was a successful experiment in love that transcends geographic boundaries, a demonstration that emotional intimacy can be maintained across decades and distances when both people are committed to honesty and mutual support. Your grandfather is one of the finest men I have ever known, not despite his capacity to love multiple people simultaneously, but because of it. His love for your grandmother was deepened rather than threatened by his connection to me. His love for me was enhanced rather than diminished by his commitment to Elena. He learned to practice love as collaboration rather than competition, and both Elena and I were beneficiaries of his emotional generosity. Keep the music box, Clara. Learn to hear the melodies that play forward and backward. Remember that some conversations continue long after voices fall silent, and that love creates its own temporal physics that allows connection across boundaries that seem absolute, but are actually permeable. With all my love and hopes for your beautiful future, Isabel. Clara folded Isabel's letter carefully, feeling the weight of inheritance, not just of stories and correspondence and antique music boxes, but of permission to love expansively, to create relationships that served her actual needs rather than conforming to conventional expectations, and to trust that the heart's capacity for multiple connections was a gift rather than a failing. She looked at Henry, who was watching her read with the patient attention of someone who had waited years to share this particular form of wisdom with his granddaughter. "Grandpa," Clara said, "thank you for trusting me with this story. Thank you for showing me that love can be more generous and more complex than I ever imagined." Henry reached for the music box and opened its lid, allowing the familiar dancing figurine to perform its mechanical ballet while the melody played forward, not backwards, but in its traditional direction, creating the kind of peaceful atmosphere Clara remembered from childhood visits, when the world had seemed simpler and love had seemed more straightforward. "Clara," Henry said, "the backwards music was never about the past. It was about preparing you for the future. Isabel and Elena wanted you to understand that you have choices about how to approach relationships, that you don't have to limit yourself to conventional models of love, just because those are the only models most people discuss openly. What hearts remember when minds forget." 6 months later, Clara was living a life that would have been unimaginable to her before the backwards music box had opened doors to understanding that love could be collaborative rather than competitive. She had begun dating David, a graduate student in philosophy who was intrigued rather than threatened by Clara's friendship with Marcus, her former boyfriend who had become one of her closest confidants. David and Marcus had developed their own friendship, discovering that their shared affection for Clara created connection rather than rivalry between them. Clara had also begun corresponding with Isabel's granddaughter, Sophia, who lived in Buenos Aires and was completing her doctorate in comparative literature. Their letters, conducted via email, but written with the same thoughtful attention to emotional complexity that had characterized Henry's correspondence with Isabel, explored questions about love, loyalty, friendship, and the ways that people could support each other's relationships rather than competing for exclusive access to each other's attention. Most importantly, Clara had begun to understand that the backwards music box experience had been designed not to teach her about supernatural communication across temporal boundaries, but to expand her understanding of what was possible in relationships when people approached love with sufficient creativity, honesty, and generosity. Henry's recovery had continued beyond medical expectations. His cardiologist couldn't explain why a man who had suffered a major heart attack should regain not just his physical strength but apparently enhanced emotional vitality. But Clara understood that Henry's improvement was the result of finally being able to share the full story of his 60-year love triangle with someone who could appreciate its complexity rather than judging its unconventionality. Clara visited Henry every Sunday, continuing their traditional routine but with expanded conversation that included discussion of Isabel's letters, Elena's contributions to the correspondence, and the ways that their collaborative approach to love had influenced Clara's own relationship decisions. They were planning to compile the correspondence into a book that would serve as a guide for other people trying to navigate the complex terrain of non-monogamous love arrangements. On a Sunday afternoon in April, while Clara was reading one of Isabel's letters from the 1980s aloud to Henry, the music box began to play backwards again. Not the familiar melody Clara had grown up hearing, but a new song entirely, one that seemed to blend elements of all the different tunes the box had played during Clara's 6 months of discovering her grandfather's hidden love story. With the backwards melody came a new, impossible conversation, this time between all three voices Clara had learned to recognize: Henry, Elena, and Isabel speaking together in harmonious overlap, their words weaving together like a musical composition designed for 3 parts. "Clara," the 3 voices said in unison, "you have learned what we wanted to teach you. You understand that love multiplies rather than divides when it's practiced with honesty and generosity. You understand that the heart has room for multiple devotions when those devotions support rather than threaten each other." Clara listened to this final backwards conversation with tears streaming down her face, understanding that she was receiving a graduation ceremony from 3 people who had spent decades learning to love in ways that transcended conventional limitations, and who had collaborated across the boundaries of life and death to pass that knowledge to their granddaughter. "The music box will play forward from now on," Isabel's voice said through the temporal channel created by reversed melody. "You no longer need to hear love backwards to understand that it exists in all directions simultaneously. You are ready to create your own love story, using the wisdom we have shared but making choices that serve your own needs and circumstances. Remember, Elena's voice added, that supporting the people you love includes supporting their other relationships. Remember that security and love comes not from exclusivity but from trust, communication, and mutual respect. Remember that the people who love you want you to be happy, even when your happiness takes forms that don't include them directly. Most importantly, Henry's voice concluded, remember that you inherit not just our stories, but our permission to write new stories that expand rather than repeat what has come before. Love is not a tradition to be preserved unchanged. It's a capacity to be developed, refined, and shared with others who are brave enough to practice it creatively. The backwards music played for exactly 7 minutes and 43 seconds, the length of time, Clara realized, that had elapsed between Henry's collapse and the paramedics' arrival at his apartment, the temporal space in which the music box had somehow arranged for this entire education in the expanded possibilities of human love. When the melody ended and the impossible conversation concluded, the music box closed its lid with the definitive click of a lesson completed. A story finished. An inheritance successfully transferred from grandparents to granddaughter. Clara looked at Henry, who was smiling with the satisfaction of someone whose carefully planned gift had been received, understood, and appreciated by the person for whom it was intended. Grandpa, Clara said, I understand now why you never told me these stories during our regular Sunday visits. I wasn't ready to understand that love could be this generous, this collaborative, this willing to support, forms of happiness that don't conform to conventional expectations. Henry nodded. And now? Now I understand that love is not about finding one person who meets all your needs, but about creating a community of people who support different aspects of your growth and happiness. Now I understand that the heart expands through practice, not through protection. Clara opened the music box one final time, watching the dancing figurine perform its mechanical ballet to the forward-playing melody that had provided soundtrack to her childhood visits with Henry. But now the familiar tune sounded different, not because the music had changed, but because Clara's capacity to hear complexity within simplicity had expanded through 6 months of discovering that her grandparents' love story was far more sophisticated and beautiful than she had ever imagined. The music box's last secret 1 year later, Clara married David in a ceremony that would have been unconventional by most standards but felt perfectly natural to everyone who understood the story of Henry, Elena, and Isabel. Marcus served as David's best man, having become David's close friend through their shared investment in Clara's happiness. Sophia attended via video call from Buenos Aires, representing Isabel's legacy and the continuing correspondence between granddaughters who had inherited permission to love expansively. Henry officiated the wedding, having been ordained online specifically for this purpose and having written ceremony texts that honored both the commitment David and Clara were making to each other and their commitment to supporting each other's other relationships. The wedding vows included promises to communicate honestly about outside attractions, to support each other's friendships and emotional connections, and to approach love as collaboration rather than possession. Elena's spirit was honored through readings from her contributions to the 60-year correspondence, passages where she had written about marriage as a partnership that could be strengthened rather than threatened by acknowledging that love comes in many forms and serves many purposes. Isabel's memory was honored through the music box, which played forward melodies during the ceremony, but had been placed where everyone could see it, a reminder that some love transcends temporal boundaries and continues to influence relationships long after the people who created it have died. At the reception, Clara gave a toast that summarized what she had learned from her grandfather's backwards love story. Love is not a finite resource that must be rationed or guarded. Love is renewable energy that expands through generous use. The people who love us want us to be happy, even when our happiness includes relationships they're not part of. The people we love deserve our support for their other connections, because supporting their emotional well-being is one of the ways we express our love for them. Clara concluded her toast by playing the music box for the wedding guests, explaining its history and the way it had facilitated her education in the expanded possibilities of human relationships. As the familiar melody filled the reception space, Clara realized that the music box's final secret was not its capacity to play backwards, or to facilitate impossible conversations across temporal boundaries, but its ability to serve as a teaching tool that could help people understand that love was far more flexible and generous than conventional wisdom suggested. After the reception, as Clara and David prepared to leave for their honeymoon, which would include a visit to Buenos Aires to meet Sofia and see the places where Isabel had lived and worked, Clara packed the music box carefully in tissue paper and placed it in her suitcase. "Are you sure you want to bring it on our honeymoon?" David asked, understanding both the music box's importance to Clara and the possibility that newly married couples might benefit from focusing on their own relationship rather than carrying symbolic reminders of complex family legacies. Clara smiled and touched the music box through the tissue paper wrapping. "I'm bringing it because it represents everything I want our marriage to include: honesty about the complexity of human emotions, support for each other's other relationships, and trust that love expands rather than contracts when it's practiced generously." Clara and David honeymooned in Argentina, where they spent 2 weeks with Sofia exploring Buenos Aires and learning about Isabel's life as a translator, traveler, and practitioner of long-distance love. Sofia showed them the clockmaker's shop, where Isabel had commissioned the temporal modifications to Henry's music box, the cafe where she had written many of her letters to Henry and Elena, and the garden where she had taught her grandchildren that love could be cultivated like plants, requiring attention and care, but growing stronger and more beautiful when tended with patience and wisdom. On their last night in Buenos Aires, Clara, David, and Sofia sat in Isabel's garden, while Clara opened the music box and let its forward melody create peaceful atmosphere for their conversation about love, loyalty, and the ways that people could support each other's emotional growth across geographic distances and cultural differences. As the music played, Clara felt the presence of Henry, Elena, and Isabel, not as supernatural visitation, but as continuing influence. The way teachers remain present in their students' work long after formal lessons have ended. She understood that the backwards music box experience had been designed to prepare her not just for marriage, but for a lifetime of relationships that would require creativity, generosity, and willingness to support forms of love that might not conform to conventional expectations. The music box played forward, creating soundtrack for conversations about the future, rather than revelations about the past, and Clara realized that this was exactly as it should be, that the wisdom inherited from previous generations was meant to inform new choices rather than dictate them, to expand possibilities rather than limit them. As the melody concluded and the music box closed its lid, Clara looked at David and Sofia and felt grateful for the community of people who had taught her that love was collaborative rather than competitive, expansive rather than exclusive, and generous, enough to transcend the limitations that most people assumed were natural and inevitable. The music box would continue to play forward from now on, creating soundtrack for Clara's own love story as it unfolded through choices that honored the wisdom she had inherited while serving the unique needs of her own circumstances and relationships. And someday, Clara knew, she would pass the music box to her own grandchildren, along with stories about the expanded possibilities of human love and permission to create relationships that were even more generous and creative than the ones she had learned to imagine. But that was a future melody, waiting to be composed by people who had not yet been born, using instruments of love that had not yet been invented. For now, Clara was content to live in the present moment, surrounded by people who had chosen to love her expansively, practicing the collaborative approach to relationships that 3 generations of her family had developed and refined through decades of correspondence, backwards music, and the daily choice to support each other's happiness in whatever forms that happiness chose to take.